Years from now, the PS4 will probably be remembered as one of the greatest consoles ever made, and that's largely thanks to its excellent library of games. Though it started out slow, as consoles often do, in the 6 years since its release, Sony's console has amassed an excellent lineup of games. But with the good comes the bad, and as is true for everything in this world, there's been plenty of disappointing stuff on the PS4 as well. In this feature, we'll be listing what we feel are 15 of the most disappointing games on the PS4. But disappointing, we should remind you, does not mean bad. Many of these games are a lot of fun. Some have vastly improved since launch and managed to turn things around from initial disappointment. Being mentioned in this list simply means that these games, when we first played them, failed to live up to the standard of quality we expected them to hit. Also note that for the purposes of this list, we will only be looking at PS4 exclusives, barring a couple entries that were either only console exclusives at launch or remain console exclusives to this day. So, with all of that out of the way, let's get into it. DRIVECLUB. When DRIVECLUB first launched, it's fair to say that it ended up disappointing a whole lot of people. Though it was stunning to look at and hit technical heights that console games rarely do even to this day, there were many who felt the game was, well, all said and done, a bit too dull, a bit too uninspired. Developers Evolution Studios would go on to provide excellent support for the game following its release, and arguably pretty much managed to turn things around, turning a disappointing launch into what was a legitimately great driving sim. Their subsequent closure, even in light of said recovery, proved to be a shockingly premature and abrupt one. The Order 1886. There's a lot that The Order 1886 gets right. Its aesthetic and alternate history setting are brimming with originality and personality, and can grab hold of your attention from the word go, while the game also tells a gripping tale and tells it well enough to keep you more than interested throughout its runtime. The thing is, its runtime is disappointingly short, which is far from its biggest flaw, because ultimately, in terms of actual gameplay, there isn't much The Order 1886 does that has not been done before, and what it does do, it doesn't do very well. For those who are looking for a great story told in an excellent cinematic fashion, it's well worth a go, but by and large, The Order 1886 fails to live up to the high expectations people had from it prior to its launch. KILLZONE Shadowfall. KILLZONE Shadowfall did a lot of things to shake up the Killzone formula that we had grown accustomed to. More open environments leading to gameplay that was far less linear than its predecessors. A larger emphasis on stealth, a visual palette that was far brighter and more varied than the one-note look previous Killzone games had sported. And it mostly succeeded in all of those things. But while it displayed a willingness to go in new directions in these areas, in others it came across as frustratingly regressive. Its campaign was full of genre cliches, the story was dull and disappointing, and not once did it provide the sort of adrenaline heights that the campaigns of Killzone 2 and 3 had been characterized by. As a blueprint for the future of the franchise, it did its job well enough, but then again, we don't even know if this franchise has a future. Gran Turismo Sport. You expect every Gran Turismo title to hit a minimum threshold of quality, and though Gran Turismo Sport, at least in terms of the fundamentals of driving and how it feels, is an accomplished racing sim, there are several key areas where it fails to hit that minimum threshold. Its selection of cars at launch was shockingly small, though Polyphony Digital has admittedly improved their game vastly in this area since launch. Most importantly though, in all of their wisdom, they for some reason decided to turn Gran Turismo into an always online title, a decision that did not sit well with a whole lot of people, and for good reason. We remain hopeful that Gran Turismo 7, whenever it launches, will go back to the roots of the series, because it's a huge disappointment that the PS4 has not received a single proper Gran Turismo title thus far. LITTLEBIGPLANET 3. Little Big Planet was probably one of the best new franchises Sony created during the PS3 era, delivering engaging and accessible platforming, and providing extensive creation tools that players could use in countless ways. Expectations from Little Big Planet 3 was pretty high because really, all it had to do was be more of the same. Though it was still a fun and charming game, Little Big Planet 3 failed to reach the heights of its predecessors. Developer Sumo Digital certainly injected plenty of new ideas, but many of these felt unfinished, while the game was also riddled with technical issues at launch. Compared to the excellent Little Big Planet 1 and 2, 3 proved to be a pale imitation. No Man's Sky. Though No Man's Sky is now available on the Xbox One, when it first launched in 2016, it launched as a PS4 console exclusive, and you don't need us to tell you how controversial its launch proved to be. Big things had been promised to us by developers Hello Games prior to launch, but the game that released was a far cry away from what many had expected it to be, lacking in many features that had been promised, and features a boring and grindy gameplay loop that got old very quick. Thankfully, with multiple major updates, Hello Games have turned No Man's Sky into a significantly better game than it was when it launched 3 years ago, and one that is much closer to the experience we had all imagined it would be. And really, with the way things have been going, it's hard to imagine a reality where the game doesn't get even better going forward. KNACK. No one expected KNACK to be a smash hit. No one expected it to be a generation-defining phenomenon. No one thought that it would join the likes of Crash, Ratchet, Sly, and Jack as Sony's iconic platforming mascots. But we at least expected it to be good, which it really wasn't. All it was a game that required minimal interaction and active participation from the player, and was completely lacking in any creative or technical oomph. To call it a bore fest would be really harsh, but not inaccurate in the slightest. That Sony decided to make this one of the PS4's only notable launch titles remains, to this day, one of the most baffling things they've done this entire console generation. And yet somehow, we still got a sequel. KNACK 2. And the sequel wasn't anything special either. Just like its predecessor, and also because of its predecessor, no one expected great things out of KNACK 2. So in that sense, maybe no one was really disappointed. KNACK 2 wasn't great, it wasn't even good, it was acceptable, achieving a bare minimum in every possible way and delivering an inoffensive yet completely forgettable experience. Sure, it was better than its predecessor, but that wasn't a very high bar to begin with. But I'm sure the inevitable KNACK 3 will be amazing. DRIVECLUB. From Software have, thanks to their efforts of the last decade, become one of the most beloved and well-respected developers in this industry. From Demon Souls to Dark Souls to Bloodborne to their most recent Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, they've just been pumping out one masterpiece after another. With the PSVR exclusive title DRIVECLUB, both the studio and Hidetaka Miyazaki were doing something very different. It was by no means a game that even wanted to aspire to the AAA glory of the Soulsborne titles, nor was it one that even tried to play remotely similarly. But it was a From Software game, so we automatically expected at least something good out of it. Well, we didn't get that. DRIVECLUB has a cool look, sure, and From's classic style of disconnected environmental storytelling can sometimes achieve an interesting effect in VR, but by and large, it proved to be a disconnected, cluttered, and unfocused game that didn't do much that was interesting. Days Gone. Days Gone's systemic open world is its biggest strength, and it paves the way for some genuinely engaging emergent gameplay. Seeing all the game's systems interact with each other, from the excellent weather mechanics to the poster boy zombie hordes and so much else, can lead to some amazing moments. But Days Gone has had the misfortune of attempting to follow in the footsteps of a string of Sony-exclusive masterpieces, and after being treated to one excellent game after another for so long, this admittedly fun but altogether rough and generic experience can't help but feel like a disappointment. Days Gone's lack of originality and clumsy storytelling does the game no favors, and though there's definitely enough potential here for Bend Studio to capitalize on it with another hypothetical sequel, in the here and now, Days Gone feels like a bit of a missed opportunity. Street Fighter V. A game that remains a PS4 console exclusive to this day, Street Fighter V saw a dramatic turnaround with the launch of the Arcade Edition, but the base game itself is probably one of Capcom's biggest and most high-profile stumbles this generation. A shocking lack of content, a small roster, and surprisingly unstable netcode were among the biggest and most notable issues with the game, and many of the updates Capcom released following its release did the game no favors either. Shadow's Fall was absolutely abysmal, while Capcom would also eventually go on to add loot boxes to the game, a decision that unsurprisingly made a whole lot of people very angry. A lot of the DLC characters and stages that were released after the base game's launch were also priced exorbitantly. It was basically a string of bad decisions on Capcom's part. It's a good thing that the Arcade Edition arrived when it did to save a sinking ship. The Inpatient. The Inpatient might have been set in the same universe as Until Dawn, but where the latter was thrilling and engaging, the former was a major disappointment. The Inpatient displayed a shocking lack of creativity and felt lacking in many of the areas where Until Dawn had shined brightest. The atmosphere and visuals were solid enough, sure, but by and large, The Inpatient was an uninteresting, dull, and monotonous experience. Basement Crawl. At its core, it was a Bomberman ripoff, but that's all it ended up being. It was generic, dull, and lifeless. It was also ridiculously short on content, a fact that was made even more aggravating by the fact that it was a proper-priced console title. While things such as confusing design decisions, poor connectivity, and a litany of technical issues turned it into an absolute train wreck. The developers would go on to release a remake of sorts the following year to right their wrongs, but all they managed to do was turn an awful game into a mediocre one. It's hard to believe that this came from the studio that would go on to develop excellent psychological horror titles like Layers of Fear and Observer. Drawn to Death. Consider David Jaffe's resume. He's the creator of Twisted Metal and God of War, both of which are arguably among the most beloved and important Sony franchises. So it's no surprise that a lot of people are expecting great things about his next project, a wacky third-person shooter called Drawn to Death. But we all know how that turned out. Playing Drawn to Death gave you the feeling that the game was purposefully trying to annoy you, with its failed attempts at humor, with its frustrating design choices, with its horrible technical issues and bugs. An interesting look was about as far as it went in terms of things that were unreservedly good about it. Shadow of the Beast. The 1998 platformer Shadow of the Beast might not be the most high-profile game you'll ever hear of, but it has a dedicated fanbase that absolutely adores it, and for good reason. As a remake, or rather a reimagining, of that game, 2016's Shadow of the Beast had a fair bit to live up to. But though it wasn't a complete train wreck, it still failed to do anything terribly interesting. It looked good, and its combat could be a lot of fun, but other aspects of the gameplay experience failed to do just that, while the game was also disappointingly brief. All of that, as well as poor platforming, lack of mechanical depth, and a disappointing story proved to be too many knocks against it in the end. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from Gaming Bolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.